Welcome to the New Mexico News Podcast, headlines and stories from the land of enchantment. Brought to you by KRQE. Here's Chris McKee and Gabrielle Burkhart.
The state's discovery violation has injected a needless, incurable delay into the instant jury trial. Dismissal with prejudice is warranted to ensure the integrity of the judicial system and the efficient administration of justice. Your motion to dismiss with prejudice is granted.
That was Santa Fe Judge Mary Marlowe Sommer dismissing the case against actor Alec Baldwin in one of the most high-profile criminal trials this year. Baldwin was seen in the courtroom breaking down in tears and then hugging his defense team, attorneys Luke Nikas and Alex Spiro. It was an ending not many of us saw coming. There was still at least a week left scheduled for trial. Baldwin was facing an involuntary manslaughter charge for the shooting death of Rust cinematographer Halyna Hutchins, which that took place in 2021 during a rehearsal for the film on a ranch near Santa Fe. Baldwin was holding the gun when Hutchins was killed, but he maintained he never pulled the trigger and that there should not have been live rounds in the chamber, and he pled not guilty to the charge. His case was recently dismissed, as we mentioned, by the judge with prejudice, meaning it will not be refiled. So how did we get here exactly? How did the case fall apart? Let's bring in our returning guest to the podcast, Jen Burrell. Jen, thanks for joining me again to talk about this case, which, to be clear, you were not involved in, correct?
That's correct. I don't have anything to do with these cases.
Okay. And you're a criminal defense attorney here in New Mexico, also still the president of the Criminal Defense Lawyers Association, right?
Yeah, for a few more weeks, yeah. I am. I've been practicing here in New Mexico for 20 years.
Okay. We've had you on before for analysis of the Rust film armorer Halyna Gutierrez's trial, in which she was ultimately convicted of involuntary manslaughter in the shooting death of cinematographer Halyna Hutchins. So same case, different roles here. Listeners can go back in your feed and listen to that episode for even more context. But Halyna Gutierrez is now seeking to dismiss her case based on some of the facts that were revealed in Baldwin's case, which we'll get to, of course. I want to sort of go back and do this in layers because there are so many layers to what happened in the trial. Let's go back to the beginning real quick. Halyna Gutierrez was expected at first to testify in Baldwin's case. And before we jump to the end, tell us, what were you and others expecting to hear in Baldwin's own criminal trial, where he finally did set foot in front of a judge and a jury here in Santa Fe to face his own involuntary manslaughter charge? What were you expecting?
Well, it's not surprising that Halyna chose not to testify, and they even had hearings on the issue, because if she was successful in her trial appeal, then obviously that testimony could be used against her. And so that was the big issue there. But, we never even got halfway through Baldwin's trial because of all the issues that came up that applied to both Hannah's case and his case.
Yeah, and opening statements, they began on Wednesday, July 10th, after jury selection. There were just so many media who came from across the country, even, some out of country, to watch this trial unfold. Prosecutors and defense attorneys laid out their arguments initially to jurors. We had Special Prosecutor Erlinda Johnson argue that day that Alec Baldwin's recklessness on set ultimately led to Hutchins' death.
You will see him cock the hammer when he's not supposed to cock the hammer. You will see him put his finger on the trigger when his finger's not supposed to be on the trigger.
Meanwhile, Baldwin's defense attorney Alex Spiro told jurors the actor had no reason to believe there would be or should be live rounds in the chamber.
So even if he intentionally pulled the trigger like the prosecutor just demonstrated, that doesn't make him guilty of homicide. He did not know or have any reason to know that gun was loaded with a live bullet. That's the key.
Jen, what was your impression of how those two teams set up their main arguments to jurors that day?
I think that's pretty much what we're seeing in the community, right? We have people who are gun owners and responsible gun owners and know that if you're holding a gun, even if it's not your gun, it's your responsibility to check it. Then we have the other camp who says, why would an actor ever check a gun? They hire all these people to do that stuff for him. He's in the moment trying to be his character. And, and so It'd be interesting to see how that splits with the jury, because the arguments that they presented were pretty much the same split we see in our own community.
Yeah, the first witness to take the stand in this case was Nicholas LeFlore. He was a Santa Fe County deputy at the time, responded to the scene the day of the shooting. Prosecutors played lapel video from his lapel that day in the courtroom, showing how that deputy basically allowed Alec Baldwin to discuss what had just happened with other people on the crew. Prosecutor Carrie Morse continued playing and pausing that video in sections to question him about his decisions that day.
Is this an ideal way to separate someone from witnesses?
After looking at it, probably not, but that's what happened.
Jen, we know from, covering other crimes that investigators are supposed to separate witnesses, right? Tell us generally, why is that so important, and what was your impression seeing how the deputies handled this case with Alec Baldwin?
It was clear that they were really overrun. There was about a little over 200 people on set. And so LeFlore was the first one on scene for a little bit, like 10, 15 minutes. And so that's a lot of time for people to kind of coordinate their stories, even if they don't mean it intentionally, but they're like, I saw this. And they're like, no, I saw it this way. And they're like, oh, maybe that's right. It may not be intentional, but just coordinating. And we also know from Hannah's trial that they had a corporate lawyer who was there trying to protect the corporate interest, who may have been also advising people on how to make a statement to police officers. And so normally when they come on a crime scene, they separate everybody immediately so that they get an accurate version of what they recall. And in this case, that just didn't happen.
Did you get the impression at all when watching that lapel video too, that maybe the deputy was, a little bit intimidated by Alec Baldwin's status? I saw the portion where he mentioned, let's go to my patrol car. And he's like, no, I want to stay right here. And he's like, oh, okay. And just let him stay right there. Do you think the fact that this is a famous actor had anything to do with how he was being treated?
Oh, absolutely. I think the star power carried on for quite some time past LeFlore. We know that they didn't even take his phone from Baldwin until months later. They had to get it from New York. And so what could have happened with data during that time? What was deleted? He could have even changed phones. Who knows? And, they just didn't follow the normal protocols. And I think that had to do with a lot of the Hollywood glitz and maybe a little intimidation.
The defense also questioned how deputies handled evidence after the shooting. Defense attorney Alex Spiro specifically raised concerns about what law enforcement did or didn't do with ammunition from the movie set.
But you don't know what happened exactly to the ammo that was in it at the time of the incident, right?
No, I do not.
So the question of how live rounds got onto the set and into the chamber was always, at the center of this case. But how local Santa Fe County law enforcement handled evidence was also a huge part of this case for both the prosecution and defense teams, right? Why is that part so crucial in a criminal case, if you could help break it down for us?
Right. And so when they are on scene and they're collecting evidence, it's not always clear what's going to be important, right? I mean, something may become, you learn that it's important when you interview people. And if it's not collected at that time, then it's not preserved. Police have no duty to collect evidence, none. But if they do collect it, they have a duty to preserve it. And so they want to make sure that they make the strongest case. So they want to collect as much as possible, and then they can kind of parse through it and see what's really the most relevant evidence for them. For a defense perspective, they don't get on scene for much later. So they can't go back months later and try to find evidence because they don't know who's had access to it. And that's kind of the same reason that they separate and control witnesses when they come on scene, because they don't want somebody throwing more ammo on the cart that may not be relevant. Those kind of things, we call it tampering with evidence, but somebody may not realize. They might just see an extra gun and put it on the cart and not realize that could be tampering. And so it's vital that everything is properly collected, logged, and preserved so that both sides can go through the evidence and determine the best way to present their case.
And I recall talking to you about this, probably before when we were discussing the Halyna Hutchins trial, but does this case say anything about how law enforcement is trained to handle, responding to potential film sets? Because we have a lot of filming in New Mexico. Should that be re-looked at
Well, I think that's definitely something that Mendoza is going to want to look at for his own officers. I don't know that's it appropriate to do statewide because there's not this kind of productions in all the smaller counties. But I think Sheriff Mendoza may definitely want to look at that and make sure that there's more than one officer responding to any calls out there just because of the size of the crew and who's on the set.
So prosecutors in this case had a witness list of about 40 people. We obviously didn't hear from most of those people. We did, though, hear from a crime scene technician, Marissa Papel.
After the Hannah Gutierrez trial, there was an individual that came to the police station and stated they had ammunition.
And they turned in the ammunition?
Yes.
And they gave it to you, right?
Yes.
And they told you that this was the ammunition that ended up with Seth Kenny that killed Miss Hutchins, right?
I do not recall all of their statements.
Defense attorney Alex Spiro mentioned a Good Samaritan who actually handed over claimed evidence after the armorer's conviction and pressed the crime scene tech about why that ammunition wasn't inventoried with the rest of the rust evidence or handed over to the defense.
Those rounds were not placed with the rest of the rust evidence, correct?
Nor were they sent to the FBI for testing with the rust evidence, were they?
No, they were not.
Jen, what's your takeaway after that information came out and the line of questioning and answers by the defense and that crime scene technician?
You know, the crime scene technician kind of doesn't have the same information that the prosecutor had because the prosecutor and the captain said that that person had come to the courthouse while the trial was still going on for Hannah and then ended up down there. But the reality is, if she is calling the prosecutor and knows that this is regarding what happened on the Rust movie set, there's no reason to give it a separate case number. And so that is the real issue that makes it an intentional act, not an accidental thing, which I think is what Judge Marlowe was really focusing on, hiding the evidence from the defense.
Yeah, so and you're saying the crime scene tech, it was revealed that she let the prosecution know that this had happened.
Yes.
Okay, and on the stand, the crime scene tech did say, well, I didn't give anything to the defense. I solely dealt with law enforcement and the sheriff's office. Is that how things are supposed to be handled?
Normally, you know, law enforcement would funnel their information through the district attorney's office. But if you look at the case law, which is Brady v. Maryland, which is what the judge ruled on, that says that any agency that's a government agency that's involved as in the investigation is an arm of the prosecution and has a duty to turn it over. And so who actually does it, you know, that's up to them, but it has to be turned over.
Yeah, and that's kind of at the heart of what the aftermath has been talked about is this Brady violation. Can you explain just what that is? What is a Brady violation?
Yeah, so it's been around for about 5 decades now. It's not a new thing. Everybody should know about it. And what it says is that the state has to turn over to the defense any evidence that could be used for impeachment, any evidence that could be used to cross-examine a witness, any evidence that may be exculpatory, that may help say that the defendant didn't do this crime. And so any kind of evidence like that has to be disclosed. And then that's the question here, was that this evidence, the prosecutor says it wasn't relevant. It's not up to her to make that decision. It's up to her to disclose it so that the defense can decide if they're going to use it in their case.
And to be clear, we're talking about live rounds, so real bullets that apparently matched some of the bullets that were on the film set of Rust, but they weren't logged into evidence under the same Rust case file. So fast forward to day 3 of the trial. It's a Friday, July 12th, and this is when things just really blew up in a courtroom bombshell.
This is unusual, but if you all don't mind, and if there's any objection, I'm going to have her step down, and when I ask her a question about which is which, she will put it out.
The judge put on blue gloves, opened an evidence bag to look at some ammunition, and ask the crime scene tech some questions of her own. Jen, had you ever seen anything like that before?
I have never seen a judge open a package, an evidence package, because the way that it's supposed to work is whoever opens it seals it back up and signs their name on it. And a judge should not be on the chain of custody, right? So it's highly unusual for her to do that. Obviously, she has the right to look at the evidence. You know, Judge Marlowe, this is not the first time that she's questioned a witness on her own. They have the right to do that, but that's clear that she wanted something specific out from that witness that neither party had done. And I think she got what she was looking for. You know, at first, the crime scene tech said that the bullets didn't look the same. And then Judge Marlowe kept questioning her until she admitted that, yes, they did look the same. And at that point, Judge Marlowe sat back in her chair, and it was pretty close to when they broke for lunch. So she was probably making her decision at that time.
Why do you think, if you can explain maybe for the layman or people who wouldn't understand why this is so significant, why do you think it was so important for Judge Mary Marlowe Summer to open that bag and look at the evidence herself?
Well, because I think if the sheriff is saying, oh, these aren't relevant, they don't look right, the judge wants to see for herself if they do look similar, if they look similar enough that it could make a difference in a case, right? Of course, we don't know what a jury would do with that information, but the defense should have the right to present that information. And if they do look similar, then that would be exculpatory information. That doesn't mean that they're automatically going to say, oh yeah, he wins, right? He's not guilty, but it does make it a little more likely that they would find him not guilty. And so that's why she was so frustrated when she saw that the crime scene technician hadn't been straightforward and honest with the court, saying, you know, the party line that they didn't look the same. And when she actually pulled them out of the bag, they did. And she eventually got the crime scene technician to admit that they looked the same.
And had the defense seen what was in that bag before those moments?
No, they had seen a photo, but just, I believe, that day. And so it wasn't anything that they knew prior. They saw a photo that led to them requesting this information and bringing it, alerting the court to it.
Is that normal for defense teams to just receive photos of evidence and not be able to physically examine evidence?
Well, if they would have been disclosed the photo with enough time prior to trial, they could have went to the sheriff's department and looked at the evidence. If they had hired their own expert, the sheriff's department could have transferred it on a chain of custody to their expert. But in this circumstance, they just learned of the evidence through this photo. And so there wasn't time to do that. And that was kind of the whole point. We don't have time to investigate this because the state hid it from us, right? And so that was pretty much the bottom line.
Got it. Then after the lunch break, prosecutor Carrie Morse called herself to the witness stand in another bombshell. This is, after her co-counsel, Erlinda Johnson, had apparently asked the judge to resign from the case. And I want to ask you about that. But first, you can see some jaws drop in the courtroom. I just rewatched part of that video when Morrissey called herself as a witness.
The information, everything that happened in this regard, especially as it pertains to me, needs to come out in the public.
All right, so you're calling yourself as a witness.
And I am.
She went on to try and explain the evidence that wasn't logged into the Rust evidence.
These are rounds that never left Arizona. They were always in the possession of Thel Reed and Troy Teskey. They never went to Texas. They never came to New Mexico. That's what all of the evidence indicated.
As a criminal defense attorney and someone with, a lot of courtroom experience, what was your takeaway? What were your thoughts when this was happening, when she called herself to the stand?
I have never in 20 years seen a prosecutor take a stand in their own case. It's highly unusual. Plus, I'm not sure that she could move forward with prosecuting this case when she made herself a witness, right? I think that's really a question. Obviously, because it was dismissed, that didn't arise as an issue. But we often advise clients not to take the stand because they're going up against expert examiners, right? And they could, say something that they didn't mean, or it be taken out of context, or there's 1,000 reasons that people don't take the stand. And for her to take the stand and question herself, I mean, she's an expert examiner. And I really believe that she thought she could talk her way out of this. And she actually talked her way into a Brady violation.
Wow. And like you mentioned, I mean, she's an expert too. She put a lot of work into prosecuting this case. Did you get the impression watching this on video, like I'm sure all of us were, that she was kind of being very defensive of her own reasoning? She said, if this has to do with, my role in this matter, I want the public to hear about it. What was your impression of that?
She had been a defense attorney before she took this, opportunity with the Russ case. And so I know that she's very aware of the obligations of prosecutors and of Brady and of the right to remain silent. And so I was shocked, but I can tell you that when prosecutors are focused on convictions rather than justice, these types of things happen more often.
Morrissey said she made the call to not include that other ammunition with the rest of the Rust case evidence, but you've explained, that shouldn't be her call to make ultimately, correct? Why is that?
That's because she doesn't get to decide how the defense prepares their case, right? All the evidence is supposed to be available to both sides, and they can both decide how they're going to prepare it. If the defense decides they want to use it and she doesn't think it's relevant, then she can file a motion to have it excluded, and then it's up to the judge. But she doesn't unilaterally get to make those decisions on what evidence the defense knows of or learns of. And so by hiding that evidence under a different case number, it was very clear that that was an intentional act to keep information away from defense counsel.
And the prosecutor's co-counsel in this case was Special Prosecutor Erlinda Johnson. We mentioned, that afternoon she had told the judge she wanted to remove herself from the case. Carrie Morse later on the stand said that Erlinda Johnson didn't want it to be a public hearing, but later we heard from Johnson, who said that wasn't exactly the case. What do you make of that whole back and forth and the prosecutor, ultimately asking to remove herself?
Well, it was very much a half truth of what Morrissey said. She said Erlinda didn't want a public hearing. What Erlinda didn't want was any hearing. She wanted the case dismissed. Even though Erlinda came out very publicly and supported the efforts to prosecute Baldwin, she thought that withholding the evidence, and she just learned of it that within the last 24 hours of that hearing, she wanted it dismissed. She didn't think there should be any hearings because the prosecutor should take an ethical role and do that. And when Carrie Morrissey refused to do that, that's when Erlinda requested from the judge to withdraw from the case, that she didn't want to be connected with that ethical violation.
Wow. In the end, Judge Mary Marlowe Summer brought the trial to a sudden ending that Friday, dismissing Baldwin's charges completely.
Your motion to dismiss with prejudice is granted.
Mr. Baldwin, any reaction?
Jen, the issue of investigators or prosecutors withholding evidence from a defense team or the court, this is a major issue. Just in Baldwin's case, it completely derailed what prosecutors and the state of New Mexico had really put a lot of time and money and effort into. Does this, in your view, kind of put a stain on New Mexico's justice system when we were in such a global spotlight?
Yeah, I think, unfortunately, this happens frequently. You may have heard last week that Lisa Tracco, who represented David Halls, who was involved in the Rust production, she had her murder case dismissed in Albuquerque because the state withheld text messages. And so it was only a few days after the Rust decision, right? We deal with this all the time. But the fact that there was so many media outlets broadcasting all over the world definitely did put a negative light on New Mexico and its justice system, which is unfortunate. Everybody just wants a fair trial and a fair opportunity to defend their clients. And so we need to make sure that prosecutors' offices and law enforcement are set up to make sure they're making proper disclosures. And, unfortunately, one of the downsides to some of the laws like providing body-worn cameras and those kind of things are just the volume that we now receive. And so we're really looking at how to ramp up personnel to be able to process all that. And I'm sure the police and sheriff's departments are doing the same as well as the district attorney's offices.
I can't begin to speculate how Carrie Morrissey is feeling about this dismissal this far removed. I mean, she did make a statement to the media afterwards and said she, disagreed with the handling of the evidence, but she respects the system. But in your view, you mentioned the Brady violations. This is nothing new. Should the prosecution team have known better about that ammunition, disclosing it?
Oh, 100%. I mean, this could have all been solved just by it having the correct case number, right? Brady violations happen, but it's rare that we see it this intentional, that they actually log them under a separate case file so that they're not disclosed with the regular evidence. Because if you were asked to, at the sheriff's department, asked to disclose evidence, you pull everything with that case number. So you're not intentionally hiding stuff, but the people who decided that it was going to be logged under a separate case file are the ones who acted dishonestly.
Got it. And it's also an argument you were seeing pop up now in other criminal cases, now that people are paying attention to this, withholding of evidence. We mentioned Halyna Gutierrez. She's already filing motions to dismiss her case based on what came out here. There are also other criminal cases that this impacts. Can you explain how you see this unfolding? Will this ultimately have an impact on Halyna Gutierrez's conviction?
Well, it could. I mean, it definitely could. Obviously, the circumstances are a little bit different. Jason Bowles came out and made a statement that they had been brought that evidence before, but it was disclosed so late in the game, he didn't have time to investigate it. And that's when the gentleman went to the sheriff's department. And so it'll be interesting to see how the judge looks at that, to see if that makes a difference in terms of him being aware of the information.
And there's also been reports now that Alec Baldwin may sue prosecutors and the sheriff's office. Can he do that, or would it open himself up to more public scrutiny in a case that he may want to be over with at this point? How does that work?
There's a concept called qualified immunity. And what that means is that you can't sue government actors if they're acting in the course of their job. And so the federal government still has that. But New Mexico did away with that several years ago. But they capped the damages at $2 million. So I would anticipate that we're going to see a lawsuit against the sheriff's department, against the district attorney's office, and possibly Carrie Morse herself personally, which means that Baldwin could recover up to $6 million.
Wow. Would that, though, have to go through like a whole civil trial?
Yes.
With another jury? And
yes, absolutely it would. I mean, obviously they could settle on it, but what they do is they talk about damages and how much money it costs them. And, normally in a criminal case, those kinds of cases wouldn't hold up, but it's because of this, of Morrissey taking the stand and admitting that they agreed to do it under a separate case number, and the crime scene technician taking the stand and admitting that she called and got permission to put it under a separate case number. It's that testimony that makes this something that would be a qualified immunity case, that used to be protected under qualified immunity, that isn't anymore in New Mexico, because we want to make sure that bad actors can be held accountable. Right. And so that is the purpose. So somebody who just normally gets an acquittal at trial isn't going to qualify for one of these kind of lawsuits. But somebody who has something really egregious happen in terms of the state's conduct, that's when these cases can be brought.
okay. What would be the basis of that lawsuit?
Could be prosecutorial misconduct, something like that. Baldwin's going to have to basically examine all of his damages. We know because he couldn't leave the country, he had to turn down a job overseas. We know he lost the $1.6 million tax credit because this case was pending. We know all the production cost delays from not being able to proceed with the trial while he was under investigation. So I'm sure that they're going to be able to monetize quite a bit. They'll probably monetize way more than they could ever recover. And one of the biggest things in those kind of cases is that if you win at all, $1, anything like that, then you're awarded attorney fees. And so, his attorneys have a lot of motivation to try to work on this case to make sure that he can recover at least the cost of holding the state accountable, even if there's not a big monetary recovery.
Wow. A lot of money spent on both sides, it seems like.
Well, we're close to $1 million on just the prosecution, right? What I think they said before the June and July invoices were tallied, it was already over 750,000. So we're probably going to be close to $1 million just on the two prosecutions. And now just the cover up could be 6 million more.
Wow. In retrospect, should it have gotten this far? I mean, the district attorney's office came out swinging, it seemed like, right after this shooting happened and said, no one is above the law. It went through different prosecutors, special prosecutors. Looking back, now that it's all over, should it have even gotten to this point?
like I said earlier, prosecutors should be focused on justice, not on convictions. It is unfortunate that the prosecutor came out so strong at the beginning before they had access to all of the information. So often prosecutors come out and say, listen, we're not going to make any decisions until we've reviewed all the evidence and the investigation is complete. And that's exactly the opposite of what happened here. It's really hard for prosecutors to back off after they make some of those tough on crime kind of statements. But if this had been a fair prosecution from the beginning, we would have never ended up here. We know that they charged him wrong. They were using a prosecutor who couldn't serve. They had the district attorney assisting a special prosecutor, which can't happen. There was a bunch of missteps from the very beginning. This case should have been resolved a long time ago. We know that there was plea negotiations for Baldwin to take the same types of plea that David Halls took. And when they had heard of the threat of a lawsuit, withdrew that plea. I don't know that that serves justice, right? Because you're afraid of a lawsuit. But unfortunately, the lawsuit has a lot more momentum now because of Morrissey's testimony. So it should have been resolved sooner. This is not a complicated case. It's just basic theories of the case. It's unfortunate.
Is there anything else I'm missing that you wanted to add or think is an important takeaway from this case that we've now been covering for almost 3 years?
I think it's really important that those involved in law enforcement follow the law just like they expect everybody else to.
Okay. Jen Burrell, thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Gabrielle.
Thanks again to Jen Burrell for taking the time to chat with me about this whole case, how it unfolded, how it fell apart, and some of the aftermath that we will continue to follow on air and online and on the podcast. Will Alec Baldwin file a lawsuit against prosecutors in this case, against the sheriff's office? That is still to be determined. And also, will Halyna Gutierrez get her conviction dismissed ultimately? That is something that her defense team is still working on. So we will bring you updates on KRQE, on air, online, and on the New Mexico News Podcast. If you have a story idea or someone you'd like to hear from on our show, feel free to reach out. I'm Gabrielle.Burkhardt@krqe.com via email and gburknm on social media. Thank you all for listening.